The horse came out of nowhere, wild-eyed and foaming, dragging the overturned cart straight toward the schoolhouse steps where Mirabelle Mercer stood frozen with her armload of primers. She had 1 second to choose between diving for the doorway or dropping everything to grab the reins, and in that suspended breath she saw the dark-haired rancher vault the fence rail 20 yards out, sprinting full speed toward the runaway with his coat flying behind him like storm clouds. Mercer Granger hit the horse's flank in a controlled collision that redirected the animal's momentum just enough to miss the steps by inches. The cart splintered against the hitching post with a crack that sent splinters flying, and Mirabelle stumbled backward as the horse reared, screaming its panic into the cold November air. Granger held on to the bridle with both hands, boots sliding in the dirt, voice low and steady as he talked the creature down from its terror. Mirabelle's heart hammered against her ribs. The primers lay scattered at her feet, pages fluttering in the wind that carried the first bite of winter down from the mountains. She pressed one hand to her chest and forced herself to breathe, watching the rancher's shoulders move under his shirt as he gentled the horse with competence that made something twist low in her stomach. She had been in Eagle Valley 3 weeks. She had spoken to Mercer Granger exactly twice, both times in passing at the general store, and both times she had felt the same uncomfortable heat climb her neck when his steady gray eyes settled on her face. The horse finally stilled, sides heaving, head dropping in exhaustion. Granger ran a hand down its neck and murmured something Mirabelle couldn't hear, then turned his head to look at her. His face was all hard angles and controlled intensity, short beard emphasizing the set of his jaw, and when his gaze swept over her from head to boots, she felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with propriety. "You hurt," he said. It wasn't quite a question. Mirabelle shook her head, not trusting her voice. She crouched to gather the scattered books, grateful for the excuse to break eye contact. Her hands trembled as she stacked the primers, and she hated that he could probably see it. Granger secured the horse to the post with movements that spoke of a lifetime around animals, then crossed to where she knelt and dropped into a crouch beside her. He smelled like leather and wood smoke, and something clean she couldn't name. When he reached for one of the books, their fingers brushed, and Mirabelle jerked her hand back as if burned. "Easy," he said, voice carrying the same low calm he'd used on the horse. "You're safe." The word landed like a stone in her chest. Safe. She hadn't been safe since the night her brother rode into camp with blood on his hands and the law 3 hours behind him. She hadn't been safe when she'd changed her name, bought a ticket west, and taken a teaching position in a town small enough that no one asked too many questions about a woman traveling alone. And she definitely wasn't safe now, standing 3 feet from a man whose reputation had been shredded by accusations she didn't fully understand, but that everyone in Eagle Valley whispered about when they thought she wasn't listening. "Thank you," she managed. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. That could have been very bad. Granger stood and offered her his hand. Mirabelle hesitated for just a fraction too long before taking it, and she saw something flicker in his expression. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. His palm was calloused and warm, and when he pulled her to her feet, the strength in his grip sent another unwelcome jolt through her nervous system. "Cart belongs to the Hendersons," he said, releasing her hand and stepping back to give her space she both appreciated and resented. "Horse got spooked by something out past the ridge. I'll get word to them." Mirabelle clutched the stack of primers to her chest like armor. She should thank him again, should say something polite and dismissive that would end this conversation before it went anywhere dangerous. Instead, she heard herself ask, "What spooked it?" Granger's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Could be a lot of things. Coyote. Rattler. Someone riding too close without thinking. Or someone riding close on purpose, Mirabelle thought, and immediately wished she hadn't. The rumors about Granger circled around cattle theft, disputed water rights, and a legal challenge that had half the town convinced he was a criminal and the other half convinced he was being framed. Mirabelle had learned early that the safest course was to stay neutral, keep her head down, and avoid entanglements of any kind. But standing here with her pulse still racing and his eyes steady on hers, neutral felt impossible. "You settling in all right?" Granger asked. "At the school?" It was such a normal question, delivered in such a carefully neutral tone, that Mirabelle almost laughed. "Yes," she said. "The children are bright. Eager. Good." He glanced past her toward the schoolhouse, then back to her face. "Town needs a good teacher." The unspoken weight behind those words pressed against her ribs. Eagle Valley had gone through 3 teachers in 2 years, all of them driven out by isolation, poor pay, or the rough edge of frontier life. Mirabelle had taken the position because she needed to disappear, but she'd discovered in the past 3 weeks that she actually liked the work, liked the children's hunger for stories and numbers, liked the way the little schoolhouse felt like a sanctuary against everything she was running from. "I intend to stay," she said, and meant it. Something shifted in Granger's expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look younger and more uncertain. "Glad to hear it," he said quietly. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged, until the sound of boots on the boardwalk shattered it. Mirabelle turned to see Sheriff Talbot approaching, his weathered face set in lines of professional suspicion. Granger's shoulders went rigid, and Mirabelle felt the air change, felt the easy competence drain out of the space and get replaced by something colder. "Granger," Talbot said, voice flat. "Heard there was trouble." "Runaway horse," Granger said. "No one hurt." Talbot's gaze moved to Mirabelle, assessing. "Miss Mercer, you all right?" "Perfectly fine," she said, fighting to keep her voice level. Mr. Granger was kind enough to intervene before anyone was injured. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but Mirabelle saw the calculation behind his eyes. In a town this small, every interaction mattered. Every alliance shifted the invisible balance of power. By defending Granger even mildly, she had just marked herself, and the knowledge settled like lead in her stomach. "I'll make sure the Hendersons get their property back," Talbot said. "Granger, you planning to stick around town today?" "Got business at my ranch," Granger said. His voice had gone flat, empty of inflection. "Unless you're telling me I can't leave." "Just asking," Talbot said. But the warning underneath was clear. Granger gave a single nod, then turned back to Mirabelle. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "You need anything, Whisper Ranch is 4 miles northwest, past the Cottonwood Grove." Then he was walking away, boots striking the packed earth in steady rhythm, and Mirabelle was left standing with the sheriff's attention boring into the side of her head. "You want to be careful, Miss Mercer," Talbot said quietly. "Man like Granger, he's got enemies. People around him tend to get caught in the crossfire." Mirabelle forced herself to meet his eyes. "I appreciate your concern, Sheriff. But Mr. Granger just saved my life. I won't repay that with suspicion." Talbot's mouth tightened. "Suit yourself. But don't say I didn't warn you." He walked away, and Mirabelle stood alone in the lengthening shadows, arms full of scattered primers and heart full of questions she couldn't afford to ask. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of distant smoke and the promise of weather moving in from the high country. She looked toward the northwest, toward the invisible line where Whisper Ranch lay beyond the cottonwoods, and tried to ignore the pull in her chest that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the dangerous competence in Mercer Granger's steady hands. That night she dreamed of her brother's face in firelight, blood on his knuckles, the weight of the truth she carried like a stone around her neck. The dust storm rolled in 3 days later, turning the sky the color of old brass and filling the air with grit that worked its way into everything. Mirabel dismissed school early and sent the children home with warnings to stay indoors. Then began the task of sealing the schoolhouse windows with rags and strips of cloth she kept for exactly this purpose. The wind had already picked up, rattling the shutters and sending tumbleweeds careening down the main street like panicked animals. She was halfway through the third window when she heard the horse outside, hooves striking hard and then boots on the steps. The door banged open and Mercer Granger filled the frame, hat pulled low, coat dusty, expression urgent. "Storm's going to be bad," he said without preamble. "You can't stay here alone. Building's not sound enough." Mirabel straightened, cloth still in her hands. "I've weathered storms before. Not like this." His voice carried absolute certainty. "I've seen the sky turn this color twice. Both times people died. You need to come with me now." Her first instinct was to refuse, to protect her carefully constructed isolation, to avoid exactly this kind of forced proximity with exactly this man. But the wind chose that moment to slam against the building hard enough to make the walls creak, and through the window she could see the wall of dust advancing across the valley like a living thing, blotting out the mountains and the sky. "Where?" she asked. "Whisper Ranch. It's close, and the main house is stone. You'll be safe there." Mirabel looked at the schoolhouse around her, at the thin walls and rattling windows, and made the calculation. Pride versus survival. Reputation versus reality. She grabbed her coat and satchel. "All right," she said. Granger's shoulders dropped half an inch in relief. He held the door against the wind while she hurried through, then pulled it shut behind them. His horse stood ground-tied, ears flat, eyes rolling white at the approaching storm. Granger swung into the saddle and reached down for Mirabel, and she had exactly 1 second to be grateful for the practical riding lessons her mother had insisted on before her brother destroyed everything. She took his hand and let him pull her up behind him, settling sideways on the horse's rump with her arms locked around his waist. The animal lunged forward before she was fully settled, and she tightened her grip, face pressed against Granger's shoulder as the wind screamed around them. The ride to Whisper Ranch took 15 minutes that felt like an hour. The dust hit them halfway there, turning the world into a choking brown twilight where visibility dropped to arm's length and breathing became an act of will. Mirabel buried her face in Granger's coat and held on while he guided the horse by memory and instinct, one hand on the reins and the other covering hers where they clasped at his ribs. When they finally reached the ranch yard, Mirabel could barely see the house, just a darker shape in the swirling dust. Granger dismounted and pulled her down, keeping one hand locked around her wrist as he led the horse toward the barn. Inside the relative shelter, he worked fast, stripping saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency, while Mirabel stood with her back to the wall and tried to get her breathing under control. The barn doors rattled but held. The sound of the storm outside was like 1,000 voices screaming. "House," Granger said, and took her hand again. They ran across the yard, bent double against the wind, and Mirabel's skirt whipped around her legs hard enough to sting. Granger got the door open and shoved her through ahead of him, then slammed it shut and dropped the bar into place. The sudden relative quiet made Mirabel's ears ring. She stood dripping dust onto the flagstone floor, chest heaving, and looked around. The main room was small but solid, stone walls and heavy timber beams, fireplace cold but laid ready, sparse furniture that spoke of function over comfort. Through an open doorway she could see a kitchen, and a ladder led up to what must be a sleeping loft. Granger pulled off his hat and coat, shaking dust everywhere. "You hurt?" "No," Mirabel managed. "Just dust." He moved to the fireplace and struck a match, getting the kindling lit with quick, efficient movements. Flame caught and spread, pushing back the gloom. In the growing light, Mirabelle could see his face properly for the first time since the schoolhouse, could see the dust caked in his beard and the tight set of his mouth. "Thank you," she said, "for coming for me." Granger looked up from the fire, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "Couldn't leave you there," he said simply. The storm raged for 2 hours, shaking the house and filling the world outside with howling chaos. Granger made coffee on the stove and produced bread and dried meat from the kitchen stores, and they ate in silence while the firelight pushed back against the unnatural twilight. Mirabelle sat on the wooden bench near the hearth and tried not to think about how small the house felt, how aware she was of every movement Granger made, how the forced intimacy was eroding the careful distance she needed to maintain. "You've got a good place here," she said finally, because the silence was becoming unbearable. "It's mine," Granger said. That seemed to matter to him. Or it was, before Talbot decided otherwise. Mirabelle wrapped her hands around her tin cup. "What happened?" "With the accusations." He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing how much truth to give. "Someone's been moving cattle off the open range, changing brands, selling them downriver. Sheriff decided it was me." "Was it?" "No." His voice was flat, certain. "But I can't prove it wasn't, and the man who can is dead." Convenient for someone. "Who?" Mirabelle asked, and then wished she hadn't, because the answer might pull her deeper into exactly the kind of entanglement she'd come west to avoid. Granger's mouth twisted. "Rich man named Carver owns half the valley, wants the other half. My water rights stand in his way. So he's framing you. Or someone working for him is." Granger set down his cup and leaned back, shoulders against the stone wall. "Either way, I lose the ranch or I prove I'm innocent. And proving innocence is a lot harder than people think." Mirabelle knew that truth too well. Her brother had sworn he was innocent right up until the moment the evidence became undeniable. And by then she'd already helped him disappear, already made herself complicit, already burned her own name and future to ash. The weight of that secret pressed against her breastbone like a physical thing. "Why stay?" she asked quietly. "If the fight's already lost." Granger's eyes found hers across the firelight, and the intensity in them made something twist low in her belly. "Because leaving means letting them win. And because this place, it's all I have that's real." The naked honesty in his voice cracked something open in Mirabelle's chest. She looked down at her hands, at the calluses forming from chalk and firewood, at the dirt under her nails that 3 weeks of frontier life had already etched there. "I understand that," she said, needing something real. "What are you running from?" Granger asked. The question was soft, but direct, and it landed like a blow. Mirabelle's head jerked up. "I'm not." "You are." He didn't move, didn't press, just watched her with those steady gray eyes. "I can see it. Same way you can see I'm not what Talbot says I am." The storm rattled the windows. The fire crackled. Mirabelle's heart hammered against her ribs as she weighed the cost of truth against the cost of lies. She had built her new life on silence and distance, on the careful construction of a respectable identity that would keep her safe from questions and pursuit. But sitting here in the firelight with dust in her hair and Mercer Granger's unwavering attention pinning her in place, safety felt less important than the fragile possibility of being known. "My brother," she said, and her voice came out rough. "He's wanted for murder. I helped him escape." Granger didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't look away, just watched her with an expression that might have been recognition. "I didn't know what he'd done when I gave him money and a horse," Mirabelle continued, words spilling out now that she'd started. "But I knew by the time the law came looking, and I lied. said I hadn't seen him. They didn't believe me, but they couldn't prove it. So I changed my name and came here. What's your real name? Granger asked. Mirabelle hesitated, tasting the last barrier between them. Mirabelle's real, she said. But Mercer, my maiden name was Kincaid. Granger's eyes widened fractionally. The Kincaid gang out of Missouri. My father and brothers, Mirabelle said. I left when I was 17. Thought I'd escaped. But family ties don't break clean. No, Granger said slowly. They don't. The silence that followed felt different from before, heavier with shared understanding. Mirabelle watched the firelight play across Granger's features and waited for the judgment, the withdrawal, the inevitable distance that would follow her confession. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and said, "Thank you for trusting me." The simple acceptance of it nearly broke her. You don't think less of me? Granger's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. Miss Mercer, half this town thinks I'm a cattle thief. The other half thinks I'm worse. I'm in no position to judge anyone's family trouble. Mirabelle's throat tightened. She set down her cup because her hands were shaking. I shouldn't have told you. Probably not, Granger agreed. But I'm glad you did. Why? Because now I know I'm not the only one fighting to be something other than what people decided I am. The words hung in the air between them, and Mirabelle felt the shift, felt the moment tip from confession into something more dangerous. She should pull back, should rebuild the walls, should remember that proximity breeds exposure, and exposure leads to ruin. But when Granger reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his, she didn't pull away. His palm was warm and calloused and solid, and his touch sent heat racing up her arm. You're not what you were born into, he said quietly. Neither am I. That's the only truth that matters. Mirabelle turned her hand over, lacing her fingers through his, and felt the world narrow to the point of contact between them. Outside, the storm screamed and battered at the walls, but inside the stone house, with the firelight casting shadows and Mercer Granger's steady gaze holding hers, she felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. The storm finally broke near midnight, wind dying to whispers and the dust beginning to settle. Granger climbed the ladder to check the loft for leaks, while Mirabelle added wood to the fire, and when he came back down, his expression was troubled. Roof held, but there's damage to the barn. I need to check on the horses. I'll come with you, Mirabelle said. He started to protest, then seemed to think better of it. Just stay close. They stepped out into a world transformed. Dust covered everything in a fine brown powder. Drifts piled against buildings and fences like strange snow. The moon was rising, turning the settled dust silver, and the air tasted metallic and cold. Granger lit a lantern and led the way to the barn, and Mirabelle followed with her coat pulled tight and her boots crunching through the grit. Inside the barn, the horses were restless but unhurt. Granger moved from stall to stall, checking hooves and running practiced hands over legs and flanks, and Mirabelle watched the competence in his movements and felt her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't quite name. At the last stall, he stopped, frowning, and Mirabelle moved closer to see. The horse inside was a young mare, dappled gray, and she was favoring her left foreleg. Granger opened the stall door and crouched beside her, fingers gentle as he examined the injury. Mirabelle knelt in the straw next to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his shoulder. Strained tendon, Granger said quietly. She must have kicked during the storm. Needs to be wrapped and kept still. He stood and retrieved bandaging from a shelf, then returned to the mare's side. His hands were steady as he worked, wrapping the leg with careful pressure while the horse shifted and blew nervous breaths. Mirabelle found herself steadying the mare's head without being asked, fingers stroking the soft nose, voice low and soothing. "You're good with her," Granger said. "I had horses growing up." Mirabel didn't say that those horses had carried stolen goods and wanted men. Didn't say that the competence she'd just displayed came from a childhood she'd spent trying to escape. Before everything went wrong. "Things go wrong for everyone," Granger said, as if he'd read her thoughts. "Question is what you do after." He finished the wrapping and stood, brushing straw from his knees. The mare lowered her head and lipped at Mirabel's sleeve, trusting now, and something about the simple gesture made Mirabel's throat close up. She'd spent so long believing she didn't deserve trust, didn't deserve softness, didn't deserve the kind of life where caring for injured creatures mattered more than survival. She looked up and found Granger watching her with an expression that made her heart stumble. "What?" she asked. "Just thinking you fit here," he said. "At the ranch. With the horses." He paused, and the weight of the unfinished sentence settled between them like gravity. Mirabel stood slowly, close enough now that she could see the dust still caught in his beard, could smell the leather and smoke scent of him under the barn smell of hay and animals. "With you?" she finished for him, voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Granger said. "With me." The air between them felt charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. Mirabel knew she should step back, should retreat to the safe distance of propriety and self-protection. Instead, she swayed forward, drawn by something stronger than fear, stronger than the careful logic that had kept her alive this long. Granger's hand came up to cup her jaw, thumb brushing the curve of her cheekbone, and Mirabel's breath caught. His eyes searched hers, asking permission, offering escape, and she answered by rising on her toes and closing the last inches between them. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, his mouth warm against hers and his beard soft where it brushed her skin. Then Mirabel's hands found his shoulders and Granger's arm came around her waist. And the kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate and real. She made a small sound in the back of her throat and felt him shudder in response, felt the careful control fracture into need. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Granger rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed, and Mirabel felt his heart hammering under her palm where it pressed against his chest. "This is a bad idea," he said roughly. "Probably," Mirabel agreed. "I don't care." "You should. I'm about to lose everything. And you've got a life here, a respectable position. Getting tangled up with me will destroy that." The words hit like cold water, and Mirabel pulled back far enough to see his face. "You're trying to protect me." "Someone should," Granger said. "God knows you've had enough people fail at that already." The truth of it stung, but what stung more was the resignation in his voice, the belief that he had nothing good to offer, that proximity to him was poison. Mirabel recognized that belief because she wore it like a second skin, the certainty that her past disqualified her from any future worth having. "What if I don't want protecting?" she said. "What if I want this? You? What if I'm willing to risk it?" Granger's jaw worked. "You don't know what you're asking." "I know exactly what I'm asking." Mirabel's voice came out fierce, surprising herself. "I'm asking to stop hiding. I'm asking to be with someone who sees me and doesn't turn away. I'm asking for something real even if it costs me." "And when your past catches up," Granger said. "When someone figures out who you really are, then we'll deal with it together," Mirabel said. "The same way we'll deal with whoever's framing you. The same way we'll deal with whatever comes next." She saw the war in his expression, saw him fighting against hope because hope was dangerous and disappointment was certain. She understood that fight because she'd been waging it since the day she fled Missouri with a new name and a heart full of ash. But standing here in the barn with the injured mare breathing softly behind them, and Mercer Granger's hand still warm against her face, Mirabelle made a choice. She chose reckless over careful. She chose now over the haunted future she'd been running toward. "I can't promise you safe," Granger said finally. "I don't want safe," Mirabelle said. "I want real." His mouth crashed down on hers again, and this time there was no gentleness, just raw need, and the kind of honesty that came from two people who'd stopped pretending they were anything other than broken and desperate and willing to bleed for the chance at something good. Mirabelle kissed him back with everything she had, hands fisting in his shirt, and when they finally came up for air, they were both shaking. "Stay tonight," Granger said against her mouth. "Storm's not fully settled. It's not safe to ride back." "All right," Mirabelle whispered, and they both knew she wasn't just agreeing to shelter from weather. They finished checking the horses in charged silence, then returned to the house. Granger gave Mirabelle the loft and took the bench by the fire, and they both pretended that the arrangement was about propriety rather than the fact that if they shared a bed, neither of them would sleep. Mirabelle lay in the darkness listening to the house settle, and Granger's breathing below, and felt something unfurl in her chest that might have been joy or might have been terror. Possibly both. Dawn came cold and clear, the sky scrubbed clean by the storm. Mirabelle woke to the smell of coffee and climbed down the ladder to find Granger at the stove, hair damp from washing, expression carefully neutral. He poured her a cup without asking, and they stood together by the window watching the sun turn the dust-covered valley to gold. "I should get back," Mirabelle said, "before the town starts talking." "Too late for that," Granger said, "but there was no heat in it. Your horse is at my barn. We rode in together on mine. Everyone will know by noon." Mirabelle's stomach dropped. She'd been so focused on survival during the storm, so caught up in confession and kissing, that she hadn't thought through the consequences. A single woman spending the night at a bachelor's ranch, even in a storm, was scandal enough to cost her the teaching position. And without that position, she had no income, no identity, no reason to stay in Eagle Valley. "I'll take you back now," Granger said quietly. "We'll say you stayed in the barn. That I didn't even know you were there until morning. That's a lie. Better than the alternative." His voice was flat, final. "I won't let you lose everything because of me." "What if I don't want your protection?" Mirabelle said, echoing her words from the barn. "What if I want to stop hiding?" Granger turned to face her, and his expression was raw. "Then you're braver than I am." "No," Mirabelle said. "I'm just tired of being afraid." She set down her cup and crossed to where he stood, close enough to see the shadows under his eyes that said he'd slept as poorly as she had. When she reached for his hand, he didn't pull away, just laced his fingers through hers and held on like she was the only solid thing in a tilting world. "We could leave," he said. "Both of us. Start over somewhere no one knows our names." The offer hung between them, tempting and terrible. Mirabelle imagined it, imagined running again, imagined building a life with Mercer Granger in some distant town where the past couldn't reach them. But she also imagined the weight of new lies, the constant fear of discovery, the slow poison of living half-hidden. She'd tried that already. It hadn't worked. "Or we could stay," she said, "and fight for what we want right here. Against Carver, against Talbot, against the whole damn town," Granger said. "You understand what you're signing up for?" "Yes." Mirabelle's voice was steady. "I do." He pulled her close, one hand coming up to cradle the back of her head, and Mirabelle pressed her face to his shoulder and breathed him in. They stood that way for a long moment, drawing strength from simple contact. Then Granger eased back enough to look at her face. "All right," he said. "We stay. We fight. But we do it smart." "What does smart look like?" We find proof carvers behind the rustling. We clear my name before he can use the courts to take the ranch. And we, he paused, mouth quirking, we try not to give the town any more ammunition than we already have. Mirabelle felt a smile tug at her lips despite everything. So no more kissing in barns. Not where anyone can see, Granger agreed, and the heat in his eyes said that privacy was going to become very important very quickly. They rode back to town separately, Granger leaving first to maintain the fiction of distance. Mirabelle followed 20 minutes later on the horse he'd saddled for her. And by the time she reached the schoolhouse, the sun was high, and the street was full of people clearing dust from storefronts and boardwalks. She felt eyes tracking her progress, felt the weight of speculation, but she kept her spine straight and her gaze forward as she dismounted and led the horse to the small stable behind the school. Inside the schoolhouse, the dust had infiltrated everything despite her preparations. She spent the morning sweeping and wiping down desks, and when the children arrived for afternoon session, they helped without complaint, chattering about the storm and the damage, and whether the Hendersons' cart would ever be fixed. No one mentioned where she'd been during the worst of it, but Mirabelle saw the questions in their eyes and knew the parents would be less circumspect. She was proven right after dismissal when Martha Hendricks appeared at the door, face set in lines of concern that didn't quite mask the avid curiosity beneath. "Miss Mercer," Martha said, "I heard you took shelter at Whisper Ranch during the storm." Mirabelle met her gaze directly. Mr. Granger was kind enough to offer his barn when the storm became dangerous. "I'm very grateful." "His barn," Martha repeated, and the skepticism was plain. "Yes." Mirabelle kept her voice pleasant and firm. "The main house remains sealed. I sheltered with the horses." Martha's mouth pursed. "Even so, people will talk." "People always talk," Mirabelle said. "I can't control that. I can only tell the truth." It was a carefully constructed truth, edited and burnished, but it was enough to give Martha pause. The older woman studied Mirabelle's face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Well, I suppose in a storm like that, shelter is shelter. Just be careful, dear. Granger's trouble, and trouble spreads." After Martha left, Mirabelle sank onto the bench by the cold stove and let out a shaking breath. The lie had held, barely, but she could feel the town's attention settling on her like weight. Every choice from here would be scrutinized. Every interaction with Granger would be ammunition for people who wanted to see her fail, who wanted to prove that a woman alone was a woman unfit. She thought about Granger's offer to run, thought about how much easier it would be to disappear than to stand and defend ground that wasn't even truly hers. But then she thought about the children's faces that afternoon, bright with learning, thought about the way this little schoolhouse had become a place that mattered, thought about Mercer Granger's hands gentle on an injured horse and his voice rough with honesty in the firelight. She wasn't running. Not this time. That resolution lasted exactly 3 days, until Sheriff Talbot appeared at the school during morning lessons with a federal marshal at his side and an expression that said the world was about to collapse. "Miss Mercer," Talbot said, "this is Marshal Garrett. He needs to ask you some questions." The children went silent, 20 pairs of eyes swiveling between Mirabelle and the two lawmen. Mirabelle's heart kicked against her ribs, but she kept her face calm as she stood. "Of course," she said. "Children, please continue with your reading. I'll be just outside." She followed the man onto the porch and closed the door behind her, mind racing through possibilities. Federal marshal meant something bigger than local gossip. Meant someone had dug deeper than her false surname. Meant the past she'd been running from had finally caught up. Marshal Garrett was a lean man with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. "Miss Mercer," he said. Or should I say Miss Kincaid? The name hit like a fist. Mirabelle's knees went weak, but she locked them, forced herself to meet his gaze. My name is Mirabelle Mercer. Your maiden name was Kincaid, Garrett said. Daughter of Clayton Kincaid, sister to James, Robert, and Thomas Kincaid, all wanted for various crimes including robbery, assault, and murder. I left that family years ago, Mirabelle said. Her voice came out steady despite the roaring in her ears. I've had no contact with them since. Yet you helped James Kincaid escape federal custody 2 years ago in Missouri, Garrett said. Provided him with money and a horse. Lied to investigators about his whereabouts. I was scared, Mirabelle said. I didn't know what else to do. Garrett's expression didn't soften. Aiding and abetting is a federal crime, Miss Kincaid. I have a warrant for your arrest. The world tilted. Mirabelle put a hand on the porch rail to steady herself, distantly aware of Talbot shifting his weight and the sound of children's voices inside going quiet as they strained to hear. This was it then, the reckoning she'd been dreading. The end of Mirabelle Mercer, schoolteacher, and the resurrection of Mirabelle Kincaid. Criminal's sister, fugitive, failure. There's more, Garrett continued. Your brother James was killed 3 weeks ago in a shootout near Dodge City. Before he died, he confessed to multiple crimes, including naming you as an accomplice. The words didn't make sense at first. James dead. James confessing. James who'd sworn he'd never betray family, using his last breaths to drag her down with him. The betrayal of it was almost worse than the fear. I wasn't an accomplice to anything except helping him escape, Mirabelle said. Her voice sounded distant, mechanical. I didn't know about the crimes. I wasn't involved. That's for a court to decide, Garrett said. He produced a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. I'm sorry, Miss Kincaid, but I need you to come with me. Mirabelle stared at the cuffs and felt the future she'd been building crumble to dust. The schoolhouse. The children. The fragile hope she'd found in Mercer Granger's arms. All of it gone, erased by the past she'd never be able to outrun. Wait, a voice said from the street, and Mirabelle's head jerked up to see Granger striding toward them. Expression thunderous. What's going on here? Official business, Talbot said. Stay out of it, Granger. Granger ignored him and looked at Garrett. You're arresting her? Federal warrant, Garrett confirmed. Aiding and abetting a known fugitive. Based on what evidence? Granger demanded. A dead man's confession? That's enough for a warrant, Garrett said. The rest gets sorted in court. Granger's jaw clenched, and Mirabelle saw him calculating, saw the same desperate math she'd just done, and arriving at the same helpless conclusion. She wanted to tell him it was all right, wanted to spare him the pain of watching her taken, but her throat had closed around the words. I'll post bail, Granger said. Whatever it takes. There's no bail on a federal charge, Talbot said, and there was something almost sympathetic in his voice. She'll be held until trial. Where? Granger asked. Denver, Garrett said. Federal court. That's 3 days' ride. Granger took a step closer, hands flexing at his sides like he was considering something violent and stupid. You can't just throw her on a horse and drag her across the territory. I have a wagon, Garrett said calmly, and a deputy. She'll be treated fairly. Fairly, Granger repeated, voice rough with barely contained fury. You're arresting an innocent woman based on the word of a dead criminal, and you call that fair? Mirabelle found her voice. Mercer, don't. He looked at her then, and the anguish in his eyes nearly broke her. I can't just let them take you. You don't have a choice. Mirabelle forced the words out, forced herself to sound calm even as everything inside her screamed. Neither do I. Garrett moved forward with the cuffs, and Mirabelle held out her wrists. The iron closed around them with a click that sounded like finality, cold and heavy and real. She felt Granger move like he was going to intervene and shot him a look that stopped him in his tracks. "Please," she said quietly. "Don't make this worse." "How could it possibly be worse?" Granger said. "You could get yourself arrested too," Mirabelle said. "And then neither of us has a chance." The logic of it hit him, and she saw him force himself to step back, saw the effort it cost. Talbot moved to take Mirabelle's arm, but Granger's voice cracked out like a whip. "I'll do it. I'll escort her to the wagon." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "All right. But any trouble and you're done." Granger took Mirabelle's elbow, touched gentle despite the violence radiating from every line of his body, and guided her down the steps. The street had filled with onlookers, faces shocked and avid and judgmental, and Mirabelle felt the weight of their stares like physical blows. There was Martha Hendricks with her hand over her mouth. There was the blacksmith and the general store owner and half a dozen children's parents, all watching the schoolteacher revealed as a criminal, all having their worst suspicions confirmed. She kept her chin up and her gaze forward, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. But when Granger's hand tightened fractionally on her arm, supportive and solid, she felt tears prick at the back of her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered, "for dragging you into this." "Don't," Granger said roughly. "Don't apologize. This isn't your fault." But it was, at least partially. She'd known the risks of getting close to anyone, had known her past was a loaded gun pointed at her future. She'd let herself hope anyway, and now Granger was paying the price alongside her. They reached the wagon, a sturdy covered rig with iron bars across the back opening. Garrett opened the gate and gestured for Mirabelle to climb in. She gathered her skirts with shaking hands and stepped up, and Granger stayed close until the last possible moment. "I'll find a lawyer," he said low and urgent. "I'll get you out of this." "Mercer," Mirabelle said. His name felt precious on her tongue, a gift she had no right to. "You need to let me go." "Like hell." His eyes blazed. "You told me you wanted to fight for something real. So did I. I'm not giving up now. This isn't your fight." "Yes, it is." His hand came up to cup her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone in an echo of that first kiss in the barn, and he didn't care that half the town was watching. "You're mine to fight for. If you'll let me." Mirabelle's breath hitched. She wanted to say yes, wanted to cling to the fierce certainty in his voice and believe it could be enough. But the iron around her wrists and the bars on the wagon and the long road to Denver stretched between now and any future worth having. "Find proof Carver's framing you," she said instead. "Clear your name. Save the ranch. Don't throw it all away on a lost cause." "You're not a lost cause," Granger said fiercely. Garrett cleared his throat. "Time to go, Granger." Granger's hand dropped and Mirabelle climbed into the wagon, settling on the hard bench inside. Garrett secured the gate with a heavy lock, and the sound of it closing was the loneliest thing Mirabelle had ever heard. Through the bars she could see Granger standing in the street, hands clenched at his sides, expression carved from stone and fury. The wagon lurched into motion and Mirabelle gripped the bench to keep from falling. She watched through the bars as Eagle Valley receded, watched Granger standing motionless until the street curved, and she lost sight of him. Then she let her head fall back against the wagon wall and closed her eyes against the tears that finally spilled over. The trip to Denver took 4 days. Garrett was true to his word about fair treatment, allowing her privacy for necessary stops and providing adequate food and water. But the iron cuffs stayed on and the nights were spent locked in the wagon while Garrett and his deputy camped outside. Mirabelle used the time to think, to plan, to shore up the walls around her heart that Mercer Granger had so thoroughly demolished. By the time they reached Denver, she had her story straight. Yes, she had helped her brother escape. No, she hadn't known the full extent of his crimes. No, she hadn't been involved in any criminal activity beyond that single act of misguided family loyalty. She would throw herself on the mercy of the court, express remorse, and hope that 2 years of honest living and a respected teaching position would count for something. She did not let herself think about what would happen if it didn't. The Denver Federal Courthouse was an imposing stone building that smelled of ink and old wood and the accumulated weight of justice. Mirabelle was processed through a series of clerks and guards, her belongings cataloged, her identity verified against the warrant. Then she was led to a cell in the basement level, small and cold and smelling of damp stone, and the door clanged shut behind her with terrible finality. She had been there 2 days when the lawyer came. He was a thin man with sharp eyes and ink-stained fingers, and he introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, attorney at law, retained on her behalf by a Mr. Mercer Granger of Eagle Valley. Mirabelle's heart lurched at the name. "Mr. Granger hired you," she said. Whitmore nodded. "Sent a wire the day you were arrested. Paid my retainer in full and instructed me to spare no expense in your defense." Mirabelle sank onto the cell's narrow cot, emotions warring in her chest. Relief that she wouldn't face this alone. Guilt that Granger was spending money he probably didn't have. Fear that it wouldn't be enough. And underneath it all, a fierce, painful joy that he'd kept his word. That he was fighting for her even when she'd told him not to. "What are my chances?" she asked. Whitmore set his leather case on the floor and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "Honestly, not good. Your brother's deathbed confession is damaging, and you admitted to helping him escape. The prosecution will argue you were complicit in his crimes all along. But I wasn't." "I believe you," Whitmore said. "But belief isn't evidence. We need to prove you had no knowledge of his criminal activities, that you acted out of family loyalty rather than criminal intent, and that your subsequent behavior demonstrates genuine reform. How do we prove that?" "Character witnesses, employment records, testimony from Eagle Valley residents about your conduct as a schoolteacher." Whitmore paused. "Mr. Granger has already sent affidavits from several townspeople attesting to your character." "It's a start." Mirabelle felt her throat tighten. "He's doing all this, after knowing me barely 2 weeks." Whitmore's expression softened fractionally. "He's quite determined. Sent 3 wires in as many days demanding updates on your case. The man clearly cares a great deal." "He shouldn't," Mirabelle said. "I'm going to destroy him." "Only if you give up," Whitmore said, "which I gather isn't your style." The trial was set for 3 weeks out, time Whitmore said he needed to build the defense. Mirabelle spent the days in her cell reading the law books Whitmore brought, preparing testimony, and trying not to think about what was happening back in Eagle Valley. Was Granger still fighting to clear his name? Had Carver made his move to seize the ranch? Had the school board replaced her yet? The not knowing was almost worse than the confinement. Then, 2 weeks into her detention, everything changed. Whitmore arrived at the cell with his case in one hand and a telegram in the other, and his expression was carefully neutral in a way that made Mirabelle's pulse spike. "What happened?" she asked. "Granger found something," Whitmore said. "Evidence related to the cattle rustling case back in Eagle Valley. He's uncovered proof that a man named Carver has been systematically framing him." Mirabelle's breath caught. "That's good. That clears him." "It does more than that." Whitmore unfolded the telegram. Apparently, in the course of investigating Carver's operation, Granger discovered that Carver had ties to your brother James. They worked together on several robberies 3 years ago. The words didn't make sense at first. Then the implications crashed over her like cold water. If Carver knew James, if they'd worked together, then Carver might have known about Mirabelle. Might have known she was James Kincaid's sister. Might have used that information. Granger believes Carver tipped off the federal marshals to your location, Whitmore continued, as leverage against both of you. Remove the school teacher who was starting to ask questions about the rustling, and remove the rancher who stood in the way of his land acquisition. 2 problems solved with 1 arrest. Do you have proof? Mirabelle asked. Not yet. But Granger is working with a federal investigator now. If he can prove Carver orchestrated your arrest, we can argue entrapment. Get the charges dismissed. Hope flared in Mirabelle's chest, painful and fragile. But that would mean Mercer's risking everything. If Carver realizes he's being investigated, he's already aware, Whitmore said quietly. Carver made his move yesterday. Filed a claim on Whisper Ranch for unpaid debts. Granger has 1 week to settle or lose the property. No. The word came out raw. He can't lose the ranch. Not because of me. He's not planning to lose it, Whitmore said. He's planning to win. Against Carver, against the rustling charges, and for you. In that order. Mirabelle pressed her hands to her face, overwhelmed by the sheer reckless courage of it. Mercer Granger was betting everything on a long shot, burning down his own carefully constructed defenses to fight for a woman he'd known less than a month. It was insane. It was beautiful. It was exactly the kind of dangerous hope she'd been afraid to believe in. What can I do? She asked. Trust him, Whitmore said, and be ready to testify when the time comes. The week that followed was the longest of Mirabelle's life. She paced her cell and read law books and rehearsed testimony until the words lost meaning. Whitmore came every other day with updates, each one a strange mix of progress and setback. Granger had found a witness willing to testify about Carver's criminal connections. Carver's lawyers had filed an injunction to prevent the testimony. The federal investigator had uncovered financial records linking Carver to the rustling operation. Carver had produced alibis for the dates in question. It was a war fought with paper and procedure, and Mirabelle could do nothing but wait and hope. Then, 6 days before her trial was set to begin, Whitmore arrived with news that changed everything. Carver's been arrested, he said without preamble. Federal charges including cattle theft, conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice. The investigator found evidence he'd been paying off local law enforcement across 3 territories. Mirabelle gripped the bars of her cell. And Mercer? All charges dropped. Property claim dismissed. Whisper Ranch is secure. The relief was so intense it nearly brought her to her knees. Thank God, she whispered. There's more, Whitmore said. In the course of investigating Carver, they uncovered evidence that he coerced your brother's deathbed confession. Threatened to harm you unless James implicated you as an accomplice. The confession is inadmissible. Mirabelle's vision swam. What does that mean for my case? It means we have grounds for dismissal. I've already filed the motion. With Carver's arrest and the tainted confession, the prosecution's case has collapsed. You should be released within 48 hours. The words didn't feel real. Mirabelle sank onto the cot, hands shaking, and tried to process the magnitude of what Whitmore was saying. Free. She was going to be free. Not just free of the cell, but free of the charges. Free of the shadow her brother's crimes had cast over her life. Free to go back to Eagle Valley, back to the schoolhouse, back to Mercer Granger and the fragile, dangerous hope they'd built together. Where is he? She asked. Mercer. Is he still in Denver? He never left, Whitmore said. He's been staying at a boarding house 3 blocks from here, coordinating with the investigator and checking on your case daily. I believe he's planning to be present when you're released. Mirabelle's throat closed. Of course he was. Of course Mercer Granger, who'd been accused of being a criminal and a liar and worse, had stayed in a strange city for 2 weeks fighting to clear the name of a woman the whole world thought was guilty. Of course he hadn't given up. Of course he'd kept his promise. I need to see him, she said. As soon as you're released, Whitmore promised. The 48 hours crawled by like 48 years. Mirabelle was processed out of detention in stages, paperwork signed and countersigned, belongings returned, a judge's order officially dismissing all charges. When she finally walked out of the courthouse into the bright Denver morning, she felt like she'd been reborn, scrubbed clean by bureaucracy and second chances. Mercer was waiting on the steps. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face shadowed with exhaustion and his clothes dusty from travel. But when he saw her, his whole expression transformed, and Mirabelle didn't think, didn't hesitate, just ran down the steps and into his arms. He caught her and held on tight, one hand cradling the back of her head, and Mirabelle buried her face in his shoulder and felt 2 weeks of fear and hope and desperate longing break over her in waves. She was shaking, might have been crying, and Granger's arms were the only solid thing in a world that had finally stopped tilting. You're all right, he said roughly, mouth against her hair. Thank God you're all right. You saved me, Mirabelle said. You fought for me. Told you I would. He pulled back just enough to frame her face with his hands, thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. Told you I wasn't giving up. You could have lost everything, Mirabelle said. The ranch, your name, everything you were fighting for. I wasn't fighting for the ranch, Granger said. His eyes were fierce and certain. I was fighting for you. The ranch only matters if you're there. The declaration hit her like lightning, illuminating everything she'd been too afraid to acknowledge. She'd spent so long believing she didn't deserve this. Didn't deserve someone who would burn the world down to keep her safe. Didn't deserve the kind of love that looked like reckless courage and impossible hope. But standing here with Mercer Granger's hands warm on her face and his heart beating steady under her palm, she finally understood. Deserving had nothing to do with it. Love wasn't something you earned. It was something you chose, and were chosen for, and fought to keep. I love you, she said. The words came out simple and sure. I love you, and I want to go home with you, and I want to stop running. Granger's breath caught. You mean that? Every word. Mirabelle rose on her toes and kissed him, right there on the courthouse steps with Denver bustling around them and the future spreading out like open territory. When they broke apart, they were both grinning like idiots. Marry me, Granger said. Yes, Mirabelle said. They were married 3 days later by a circuit judge in a Denver chapel, with Whitmore and his wife as witnesses. Mirabelle wore her burgundy dress cleaned and pressed, and Granger wore a new shirt he'd bought specifically for the occasion. And when they spoke their vows in front of the judge and God, Mirabelle felt the last of her fear burn away in the face of pure, reckless joy. The trip back to Eagle Valley took 5 days, but this time Mirabelle rode beside Granger on her own horse, a sturdy mare he'd purchased with the last of the money he'd set aside for legal fees. They camped under the stars and talked until the fire burned low, sharing stories and secrets and plans for the future. Granger told her about growing up on the ranch, about losing his parents young and fighting to keep the land his father had built. Mirabelle told him about her mother's death, about the slow dissolution of her family into crime and violence, about the day she'd finally chosen herself over blood loyalty. By the time they crested the ridge overlooking Eagle Valley, Mirabelle felt like she knew Mercer Granger down to his bones, and he knew her the same way. It was terrifying and liberating and absolutely right. The town was smaller than she remembered, the main street dusty and familiar. They rode straight through without stopping, ignoring the stares and whispers, and continued northwest toward Whisper Ranch. When the Cottonwood Grove came into view, Mirabelle felt her chest tighten with something that felt like homecoming. The ranch house was just as she remembered it. Stone walls solid against the autumn wind. Smoke rising from the chimney where someone had laid a fire. Granger had sent word ahead, and when they rode into the yard, his ranch hand emerged from the barn to take the horses, grinning at the sight of them together. "Welcome back, boss," the hand said. "Both of you." Inside the house was warm and clean, the fire crackling cheerfully and supplies stocked in the kitchen. Granger had arranged it all before leaving for Denver, prepared for the possibility that he'd return with a bride. The faith implicit in that preparation made Mirabelle's eyes sting. She set down her traveling bag and turned to find Granger watching her from the doorway, expression tender and uncertain. "What?" she asked. "Just making sure you're real," he said. "That this is real." Mirabelle crossed to him and took his hands, lacing their fingers together. "It's real," she said. "We're real. And we're home." He pulled her close and kissed her, slow and sweet, and Mirabelle melted into him with the bone-deep relief of someone who'd finally stopped fighting gravity. When they broke apart, Granger rested his forehead against hers and smiled. "Mrs. Granger," he said, testing the name. "Mirabelle Granger," she agreed. "Mirabelle Granger, wife of a rancher, former fugitive, current school teacher if the town will have me back." "They'll have you back," Granger said. "Whitmore sent the dismissal paperwork ahead, and I may have had words with the school board about rushing to judgment." "You didn't." "I did." He grinned. "Told them if they didn't reinstate you, I'd pull funding for the new schoolhouse addition I'd been planning to donate." "Mercer." Mirabelle laughed despite herself. "You can't bribe the school board." "Watch me," he said, and kissed her again. They spent the rest of the day settling in, unpacking Mirabelle's few belongings and making plans for the future. Granger showed her the account books for the ranch, the contracts he'd secured for next season's cattle sales, the improvements he wanted to make to the barn and outbuildings. Mirabelle told him about the curriculum she'd been developing, the books she wanted to order for the school library, the literacy program she hoped to start for the ranch hands and their families. It was mundane and domestic and absolutely perfect. That evening they sat by the fire and Granger pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "I got something for you," he said. "In Denver." Mirabelle took the paper and unfolded it carefully. It was a land deed, freshly registered, naming her as co-owner of Whisper Ranch. Her breath caught. "Mercer, this is... You don't have to." "Yes, I do," he said firmly. "This ranch is ours. Everything I have is yours. I want it legal and binding and on record." Mirabelle looked at the deed, at her name written in careful script next to his, and felt the full weight of his trust settle over her like a blessing. He was giving her security, giving her a stake in the future they were building, giving her proof that he saw her as an equal partner in all things. It was more than she'd ever imagined having. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you," he echoed, "for choosing this, for choosing me." They made love that night in the loft under heavy quilts, slow and tender and achingly real. Afterward, Mirabelle lay curled against Granger's side, listening to his heartbeat steady under her ear, and felt peace settle into her bones for the first time in years. The next morning they rode into town together. The looks they got ranged from shocked to scandalized to grudgingly approving. Granger kept Mirabelle's hand tucked in the crook of his arm as they walked down the main street, publicly claiming her in a way that left no room for doubt or speculation. They stopped at the general store for supplies, the bank to file the ranch deed, and finally the school board office where they found the chairman waiting with an expression that was equal parts embarrassed and relieved. "Miss Mercer," he began, then caught himself. "Mrs. Granger. We received word of the dismissal of charges. The board would like to formally apologize for any premature conclusions we may have reached." Mirabelle kept her voice pleasant. "Are you offering me my position back?" The chairman glanced at Granger, who gave him a look that could have frozen water. "Yes," the chairman said quickly, "if you're willing to return. The children have missed you." Mirabelle felt Granger's hand tighten on hers, supportive, and she squeezed back. "I'm willing," she said, "on one condition." "Name it," the chairman said. "You agree to fund a proper teacher's cottage on the school grounds. My husband and I will be living at Whisper Ranch, but I'll need a place to stay during the week when weather makes the commute impractical." The chairman blinked. That's reasonable. I'm sure we can arrange something." "Good," Mirabelle said. "Then I accept." They left the office to find a small crowd had gathered. Townspeople who'd heard about the arrests and dismissals and wanted to see for themselves. Mirabelle recognized faces from church, from the general store, from parent meetings at the school. She also recognized the calculation in their eyes, the reassessment of her place in the town hierarchy now that she'd been cleared and married to a man whose innocence had been publicly vindicated. Martha Hendricks stepped forward, face flushed. "Mrs. Granger," she said, "I owe you an apology. We all do. We should have trusted you." Mirabelle met her eyes steadily. "You did what you thought was right with the information you had. I can't fault you for that." "Still," Martha said, "I'm glad you're staying. The children need you." It was an olive branch, carefully extended, and Mirabelle took it with grace. "Thank you, Martha. I'm glad to be back." The crowd began to disperse, conversations resuming in lower tones, and Mirabelle felt the town's attention shift from hostile to merely curious. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it was a start. She'd have to earn back their trust one day at a time, one lesson at a time, one small act of ordinary decency at a time. But she'd done harder things. She'd survived. And now she had Mercer beside her, solid and steady and absolutely hers. They walked back to where the horses were tied, and Granger helped her mount before swinging into his own saddle. As they rode out of town, Mirabelle looked back once at the schoolhouse, small and white against the autumn sky, and felt a fierce surge of possessive joy. That was hers. This life was hers. The future spreading out ahead of them was hers and Mercer's to build together. The winter that followed was hard but good. Mirabelle taught school 4 days a week, riding back to the ranch every Friday to spend long weekends with Granger. They worked side by side repairing storm damage, caring for the horses, planning for spring planting. Slowly, carefully, they built a life that felt real and earned, and absolutely theirs. The town's opinion shifted gradually from suspicion to acceptance to something approaching respect. Mirabelle's students thrived under her teaching, and when the spring examinations came, 3 of them qualified for advanced studies in Denver. The school board voted to fund not just a teacher's cottage but a full expansion of the schoolhouse, adding 2 classrooms and a proper library. Granger's ranch prospered. With Carver gone and the water rights secure, he was able to expand his herd and negotiate better contracts. He hired 2 more hands and began the process of building a proper foreman's house on the north pasture. When Mirabelle asked why he needed a foreman's house, he'd grinned and said they'd need somewhere to put the ranch manager once their children were old enough to take over the main house. Children. The word had sent a thrill through Mirabelle's chest, terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. By summer, she was pregnant. The pregnancy was easier than she'd feared, though the morning sickness in the first months was brutal. Granger hovered and fretted and drove her slightly crazy with his protective instincts. But she loved him for it anyway. The town women rallied around her with advice, and hand-me-down baby clothes and casseroles delivered to the ranch with cheerful regularity. Mirabelle, who'd spent so long alone and isolated, found herself part of a community in a way she'd never imagined possible. The baby, a daughter, was born in late winter during a snowstorm that trapped the midwife at the ranch for 3 days. Mirabelle labored through the night with Granger holding her hand and the midwife coaching her through each contraction. And when the baby finally arrived, red-faced and screaming and perfect, Mirabelle held her daughter and wept with joy so intense it felt like breaking. They named her Sarah, after Granger's mother. The months that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and overwhelming tenderness. Mirabelle took a term off from teaching to focus on the baby, and Granger rearranged his work schedule so he could be home more. They learned together how to soothe Sarah's cries, how to interpret her different sounds, how to function on 2 hours of sleep and still find moments to laugh. When Sarah was 6 months old, Mirabelle returned to teaching part-time, bringing the baby with her to school. The students adored having an infant in the classroom, and Sarah seemed to thrive on the attention, gurgling happily from her basket while Mirabelle taught fractions and grammar. Life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable and good. The ranch continued to prosper, the school grew. Mirabelle and Granger's marriage deepened into something steady and unshakable, built on trust and partnership, and the kind of love that showed up in quiet daily choices. 3 years after Sarah's birth, a son followed. Then another daughter 2 years after that. The ranch house expanded to accommodate the growing family. Rooms added and furniture shifted and the loft converted into proper bedrooms. The children grew up running wild between the ranch and the schoolhouse, learning to ride and read and rope cattle with equal enthusiasm. Mirabelle taught them their letters and Granger taught them the land, and together they built a family that bore no resemblance to the broken, violent clan Mirabelle had fled. On Sarah's 10th birthday, Mirabelle stood on the porch watching her daughter race her younger siblings across the yard, their laughter bright against the summer evening. Granger came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, chin resting on her shoulder. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Staying. Fighting instead of running." Mirabelle leaned back against his chest, solid and warm and home. "Not for a second," she said. "Good," he said. "Because I'm planning to keep you for a long time yet." She turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and sweet, tasting 10 years of partnership and promise. When they broke apart, the children were calling for them, demanding arbitration in some elaborate game that involved the horses and a disputed rulebook. Granger groaned good-naturedly and Mirabelle laughed, and together they walked down the porch steps into the golden chaos of their life. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Mirabelle sat at the kitchen table with a lamp and a letter. She'd been composing it in her head for weeks, weighing words and consequences, and now she finally let herself write it. The letter was addressed to the federal marshal's office in Missouri, and it contained a full accounting of her family's crimes as she knew them. Locations and names and dates. It was the final severance, the last cut between who she'd been born as and who she'd chosen to become. She signed it Mirabelle Kincaid Granger, sealed it, and set it aside to post in the morning. Granger found her there an hour later, staring at the sealed envelope. He read the address and understanding crossed his face. "You sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," Mirabelle said. "It's time." He pulled her to her feet and into his arms, and Mirabelle pressed her face to his shoulder and breathed in the familiar scent of him. She'd spent so long running from the past, terrified it would destroy any future she tried to build. But standing here in the house they'd made together, with their children sleeping upstairs and a decade of love behind them, she finally understood. The past had shaped her, scarred her, taught her what she didn't want to be. But it didn't own her. Not anymore. She'd chosen love over fear, partnership over isolation, staying over running. And that choice, made and remade every day for 10 years, had given her a life worth defending, a family worth protecting, a future worth believing in. The letter went out the next morning, and Mirabel never heard back. But she didn't need to. The silence was answer enough. Years continued to pass, each one adding layers to the life they'd built. The children grew and learned, and eventually began to make their own choices about the future. Sarah showed a talent for teaching and started helping at the school. The eldest son, strong and steady like his father, took naturally to ranch work. The youngest daughter had her mother's fierce determination and her father's steady eyes, and Mirabel suspected she'd end up doing something none of them could predict. The town of Eagle Valley grew too, enough to support a second school and a proper church and a telegraph office. Mirabel served on the school board and helped establish a lending library. Granger expanded the ranch into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory. Together they became pillars of the community, the kind of people younger couples looked to as examples of what a partnership could be. But the best moments, Mirabel thought, were still the quiet ones. Sunday mornings on the porch with coffee in the sunrise. Evenings by the fire with Granger reading aloud while she mended or knitted. The rare nights when the children were all away at friends' houses, and she and Granger had the ranch to themselves. And they'd lie in bed talking until the stars wheeled overhead. On their 15th anniversary, Granger surprised her with a trip to Denver. Just the two of them, a week away from the ranch and the school and the endless demands of their busy lives. They stayed in a hotel that felt impossibly fancy after years of frontier simplicity, ate in restaurants, and walked the city streets hand in hand like the newlyweds they'd once been. On the last night, Granger took her to the courthouse where she'd been held and released all those years ago. It was evening. The building closed, but they stood on the steps where they'd first embraced as free people and looked out over the city lights. "You saved me here," Mirabel said quietly. "We saved each other," Granger corrected. "You gave me something worth fighting for." "I just fought." "You did more than fight," Mirabel said. "You believed. When everyone else thought I was guilty, when I thought I was guilty, you believed I was worth saving." Granger pulled her close, arms around her waist, and Mirabel leaned into him with the ease of 15 years of trust. "Because you are worth saving," he said, "and because I loved you. Still do. Always will." "I love you too," Mirabel said, "more than I thought possible." They stood there as the evening deepened into night. Two people who'd been broken by their pasts and rebuilt by their choices, holding each other on the steps where their future had truly begun. Mirabel thought about the frightened woman she'd been, running from her name and her history and any possibility of connection. She thought about the moment she decided to stop running, to fight for something real, to believe that love could last. That choice had cost her, had demanded courage and faith and a willingness to be vulnerable in ways that still sometimes terrified her. But it had also given her everything: a partner, a family, a home, a life that felt earned and true and absolutely hers. She wouldn't trade it for anything. They returned to Eagle Valley the next week, back to the ranch and the children and the routines that made up their days. But something had shifted during that week away, some final settling of accounts with the past. Mirabel felt lighter, freer, more certain than ever that the choices she'd made were the right ones. Life continued its steady rhythm. The children grew and eventually began to leave, Sarah to teaching. the boys to ranching ventures of their own, the youngest daughter to college in the East. Mirabel and Granger found themselves alone in the ranch house again, the rooms too quiet after years of chaos. But they filled the silence with each other, with conversations that ranged from mundane to profound, with shared work and shared rest, with the comfortable intimacy of two people who knew each other's thoughts before they were spoken. They were in their 50s now, graying and settling, and Mirabel thought they'd never been more beautiful to each other than they were in this season of life. One spring morning, Mirabel was working in the school garden with a group of students when a stranger rode up, dusty and travel-worn. He introduced himself as a journalist from back east, writing a series on frontier women who'd made significant contributions to their communities. "I'd like to interview you," he said to Mirabel. "Your story is remarkable. From accused criminal to respected educator. It's exactly the kind of narrative my readers want to hear." Mirabel's first instinct was to refuse, to protect the privacy she and Granger had built. But then she thought about the young women who might read that story, women who felt trapped by their pasts or their families or their mistakes, women who needed to hear that change was possible, that you could choose differently, that love and courage could build something new. "All right," she said. "I'll do the interview." She talked to the journalist for hours, telling him about her family, about the choices that led her west, about Mercer Granger and the storm that brought them together. She talked about the arrest and the trial and the fight to clear both their names. She talked about building a life from ash and determination, about learning to trust and be trusted, about the slow, patient work of earning a place in a community. When the article was published 3 months later, it was fair and honest and more moving than Mirabel had expected. Letters began to arrive at the school, from women across the country sharing their own stories of starting over, of fighting for second chances, of choosing love over fear. Mirabel answered every single one. The years continued to accumulate, each one adding weight and texture to the life Mirabel and Granger had built. They celebrated 20 years together, then 25. The ranch passed to their eldest son, who ran it with the same steady competence his father had shown. The school expanded again, and Mirabel trained a younger teacher to eventually take her place. On their 30th anniversary, Granger took Mirabel riding out to the ridge overlooking the valley, the same spot where they'd first come home together after Denver. The view was unchanged. The mountains still rising blue and distant, the valley still spread out green and gold below. "Remember when you asked if I regretted staying?" Granger said. "Regretted fighting instead of running." Mirabel nodded, remembering that conversation on the porch, Sarah's 10th birthday a lifetime ago. "I've been thinking about that," Granger continued, "about all the things we could have done differently. Could have run to California. Could have started over somewhere no one knew us. Could have avoided all the hard fights and the scandal and the years of proving ourselves. And?" Mirabel prompted. "And I wouldn't change a single thing," Granger said. "Because all of it, every hard choice and every battle and every moment of doubt, it all led to this, to you and me and the family we built, to 30 years of waking up next to the person I love most in the world, to a life that feels real and earned and absolutely right." Mirabel's throat tightened with emotion. "I wouldn't change anything either," she said. "Not the pain or the fear or the uncertainty. Because it taught me what I was capable of. Taught me I could choose courage, could choose love, could choose you." She leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and they stood together watching the sun track across the valley they'd defended and claimed and made their own. Eventually, they rode back to the ranch, back to the house that held decades of memories, back to the life they'd built one choice at a time. That evening, they sat on the porch with coffee and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. and Mirabelle felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. She'd run for so long, believing safety lay in distance and anonymity. But real safety, she'd learned, came from connection. From the people who knew your worst secrets and loved you anyway. From the courage to stand your ground and defend what mattered. From the radical act of believing that you deserved good things, deserved love, deserved a future built on truth instead of fear. Mercer Granger had taught her that. Or maybe they'd taught each other. Either way, she was grateful. The stars came out one by one, filling the sky with light, and Mirabelle reached for her husband's hand. He laced his fingers through hers, the gesture as familiar now as breathing, and they sat together in companionable silence as the night deepened around them. Somewhere in the house a clock chimed the hour. Somewhere in the valley the river ran steady toward the distant sea. Somewhere beyond the mountains the world continued its complicated dance of violence and redemption, of people running and people standing their ground, of choices made and consequences faced. But here, on this porch, in this moment, Mirabelle Kincaid Granger was exactly where she belonged, with the man she loved, in the life they'd fought for, under the vast western sky that had witnessed their struggles and their triumphs and their enduring, reckless, absolutely real devotion. She'd stopped running. She'd chosen love. And she'd never been more certain that it was the right choice, the only choice, the choice that made everything else worthwhile. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and pine and the promise of weather moving in from the high country. Granger squeezed her hand and Mirabelle squeezed back, and together they watched the stars wheel overhead. Two people who'd been broken and remade. Two people who'd chosen each other against all odds and built a life worth defending. And in that moment, with the night vast around them and the future still unfolding, Mirabelle felt something she'd spent a lifetime searching for. Peace. Home.